Hi, everyone. My name is Jess. I want to thank you all for joining our webinar today on talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in people and culture. And so let's dive into it by starting off with a land acknowledgement. And so we start off all of our webinars, our trainings, our events with the land acknowledgement because it's important and critical that we are acknowledging the indigenous peoples of the lands that we're on, even though we're meeting virtually. So I want to say that Healing Equity United is on the lands of the Muwekma, the Ohlone, the Piscataway, and the unceded Duwamish territories. We want to take this moment to recognize that we have and we continue to benefit from the use and occupation of the lands that we're on, even before the United States was a nation. And although the numbers vary, what we do know is that in the 1400s, there were approximately 100 million indigenous peoples throughout the Americas already here. And today, unfortunately, in the US, there's only 6.8 million indigenous peoples left and 574 federally recognized tribes. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted upon indigenous peoples in the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands, the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and their culture, which unfortunately still continues today. So please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past and the present, and to consider how we are and can each in our own way try to move forward to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities. We encourage you to take action in support of Indigenous communities by looking up the lands that you are on, educating yourselves about the communities who are native to your land, share your learnings with others, and take other actions to support the local communities. Thank you.
We'd also like to offer a genuine welcome from HEU to you. So into this space, we welcome people of all genders. This may include people who identify as women, men, trans, gender queer, or others. We welcome people of African descent, Black, African American, Asian descent, Arab descent, Pacific Islanders, European descent, those who identify as Hispanic, Latinx, people indigenous to this land, and people of mixed and multiple descents. We welcome all of the languages that might be spoken by you all: Spanish, English, indigenous languages, sign language, etc. We welcome people from different class backgrounds: working class, middle class, owning class, or those of us who aren't sure which of these labels in the class spectrums might apply to us. We welcome people currently struggling to get access to resources necessary for survival, like healthcare, adequate housing, reliable transportation, childcare, and those of us who might currently have more access to those resources. We welcome into this space people with disabilities, visible or invisible, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, queer, or others for whom none of those labels might fit. We welcome your bodies and the different ways that you might experience yours. That might include chronic pain, strength, tension, etc. We welcome survivors. We welcome people who identify as activists and those who do not. We welcome the single, married, partnered, dating, those in monogamous relationships or those in polyamorous relationships. We welcome those who are sexually active and those who are not, those who are in their teens, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or beyond. We welcome your range of emotions, joy and bliss, grief, rage, indignation, contentment, disappointment. We welcome those who support your ability to join us today. That might include your family's genetic or otherwise. We welcome people with different faiths, religious traditions, faith practices, private practices that don't belong to a tradition, agnostics, atheists, and seekers. Last but not least, we welcome those who have been in sessions like these in the past and those who have not. So from Healing Equity United to each and every one of you, welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Fiona Oliphant, and I'll just share some of the identities that I come into the space with. You'll see them here. I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to being naturalized citizens. And so the oppression that immigrants, particularly those without documentation in this country, face was a real lived experience as I was growing up. Having said that, I have to acknowledge the identity that holds a lot of power in the society. I'm a US citizen. I was born and raised in the United States. And I always have to ask myself how I might leverage that identity to be in solidarity with the immigrant community. Underneath the American flag, you'll see scales of justice. I'm an attorney barred in New York and Washington, D.C. And even though I don't currently practice law, I have to be mindful of the amount of legitimacy and power and privilege that folks give my experiences and perspectives when they find out that I am an attorney. I'm from New York City, so you see the Big Apple there. I'm from the South Bronx, a community that's primarily Black and Brown, higher rates of crime, drug use, poverty, and higher rates of love and support. And finally, for these purposes, I am married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. We talk about the fact that people assume he has a right to belong. People talk about and give him a lot of privilege due to his white maleness or his maleness or his whiteness. We have three children who are half Black, half white. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father because that reflects her lived experience in this society.
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, everyone. I will also share some of the identities that I come into the space with. My name is Cassie Whitebread. I use she, her pronouns. I identify as second generation Chinese American. I also identify as mixed race or biracial as I have a white father. I am native to New Jersey, though I call the city of Philadelphia home. That's where I went to grad school. I had my master's in education, and I started my career as a middle school science teacher. So I identify as an educator through and through. I currently live in Seattle, Washington with my partner and dog who are pictured there. And I also wear the hat as an education director for a small nonprofit out here.
So hi everyone, my name is Jess and I identify as a first generation immigrant. I was born in Hong Kong, which when it was a British colony, my parents immigrated to the US when I was about 4 years old. They didn't have any education. They worked blue collar jobs overnight. I was very much a latchkey kid. I was also the first in my family to learn English and take ESL classes. And so I became the de facto interpreter, translator for my parents. And that's a role that I still play to this day. Currently, I am located in Oakland, California, where I live with my partner, who's a community organizer, along with our two dogs. Hanson is pictured above. He's my service animal, as well as Kobe, who is my pandemic puppy. So that's a little bit about me. And just to tell you a little bit about Healing Equity United. And so Healing Equity United is a women-owned, women-founded consulting firm that Fiona and I started about 5 years ago, essentially because we saw that a lot of times in the different nonprofit roles that we held, people at the top, the decision makers, executive directors, people who were working at foundations didn't look anything like us. And we were constantly called in to help nonprofits kind of figure out like, well, how do we serve people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color? And so we came together and decided that we wanted to impact more nonprofit organizations around the country. And so our mission is really, to foster equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we do that through providing direct consulting, assessments to determine where your organization is, workshops and trainings. Today, you're going to get a little preview of what that looks like, as well as direct executive coaching. So that's a little bit about what we do.
And so our group agreements that we hope you will agree to during our time together in the Zoom room today, I'll read them aloud for accessibility purposes. There's no room for the oppression Olympics in this space. At Healing Equity United, we recognize that our oppressions are tied and therefore our liberations are tied as well. Expect and accept challenging moments. Practice engaged listening to the best of your ability. Focus on your own learning. What's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. So keeping confidential any stories that might be shared in the Q&A. Address the group, not an individual. And last but not least, take care of yourself. So if you need to take a break, give your eyes a break, do what you need to do during this time. And so our goals for our time together today, to recognize how oppression of historically excluded communities led to today's norms and practices in human resources or people and culture. And learn the different ways that we can start building a culture of equity and inclusion in nonprofits through reimagining human resources.
So let's get started and dive right in. I'm going to provide just a little bit of backdrop in terms of history of human resources, and then we're going to shift from history to what's the connection to diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and how can we change this narrative and really lift up equity with people and culture. So in terms of the history of human resources, it really, and there is some controversy around this, but most say that it dates back to the 18th century. Two men, Charles Babbage and Robert Owen, and they came up with this focus on how to make workers as efficient as possible to really maximize money-making potential, right? And so they said that it was people who could drive efficiency. Now, this was tied to the Industrial Revolution and then shifted into a moment of labor unrest where you had people, those who were working in factories and working excessive hours and dangerous situations, saying, hey, factory owners in general, these are dangerous situations. We're not getting paid enough. You also had the backdrop of several factory fires, workers dying in humiliating and horrible and inhumane situations. That flowed into the Great Depression when companies were falling apart. People were losing money in the stock markets, and companies shifted away from that sort of lifting up of the individual to humanize their experience, hopefully make the worker happy so that they could be a bit more efficient and make us money, to really drilling down on, we have to focus on the bottom line. We have to focus on our companies and how to really maximize profits. And so they shifted to really focusing on how to manage people, how to supervise people, how to maybe take what was learned during World War II and shifting that to human resources in terms of roles and functions and, direct line and chain of command. Basically, how could we translate that into the office? And we have a couple of resources that we can provide for you. One is, some of this is from the Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tema Okun. And we have another link that we can put in the chat for you. But let's move on. So since the publication in 1977 of the visible hand. Historians have tended to connect the development of like today's business practices with what was happening in the 19th century railroad industry. And they viewed what happened during the enslavement era as pre-capitalistic and maybe even quote unquote primitive. And it's a more comforting origin story, one that protects the idea that America's economic ascendancy was developed not because of, but in spite of Black folks working on plantations without compensation. But management techniques used at that time are implemented during corporate settings, and it shifted to what we see here today in human resources. So what we can say is that human resources today, management practices today, date all the way back to how enslavement was handled, profitized, and advanced. And this last one, okay, I'm gonna admit, y'all, this is not the most engaging of reading material, but it is really informative in terms of if we're looking at human resources today, accounting today, how we try to strive towards efficiency today, it's really important to be informed about the basic ties to enslavement in that era, and how we might shift away from those policies and practices that were originally created during enslavement. So some of those might include our supervision structures, right? The way we manage and supervise employees, the documentation of humans as resources, i.e. human resources. And that's exactly how we got the term human resources, because there was a focus during the enslavement era of, well, several of these are really, and I will say this before, I will give this warning before I say the information. Several of these were inhumane and horrific. So for example, how many enslaved people can we afford to kill, who die due to inhumane circumstances, or who we can maim and still make a profit, right? And that was the question of, these people, how can we maximize the end game, the profit, the bottom line, how many can we afford to lose as we're going into this? And so, enslaved folks were treated as commodities, forced to meet quotas, right? They got rewards or certain benefits if they met those quotas, and they were punished if they did not, right? So think of our structures today and how we have incentives in the workplace to enhance performance and efficiency, right? Like that entire mindset was still rooted back then. In this book, Accounting for Slavery, there's also the point that is made about overseers, who were the middlemen, right? Who had to literally oversee the work of enslaved folks and report back on the level of productivity, which led to the term that we still use, a supervisor, right? And that plantation overseers were the first salaried employees in this sort of pre-corporate structure or pre-nonprofit structure. So back then, even the term back-breaking work, or the term the grind, right? referred to enslavement practices and lived experiences because it was literally backbreaking, right? The experiences that they had to have. And if you fast forward to today, right? And we can get into a whole nother conversation about the pay structures in nonprofit organizations, who's being paid a livable wage as a nonprofit employee, who is not, back-to-back meetings, right? Unrealistic expectations, and all of that kind of thing. But I know that Jess is going to get into it a bit more. Jess?
Yeah, thank you, Fiona, for that background and that history. I think that it's important for us to know where we've come from, right? In order for us to really consider, what could anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices and HR/people and culture and management how might we think about that differently? And so I'm going to talk about a couple of different ways, and then we're gonna really, invite you all to share ideas that you may have as well as they come up. And so the first thing that I'm going to talk about is, human resources, AKA people and culture, right? And so really around recruiting and hiring practices. And so when we're thinking about recruitment and hiring, one of the things that we often think about is like, well, we want to hire for the best person that we can, right? And that's great. But if you're thinking about recruiting for diversity, and I think some of you have put that into the chat, that's something that you're thinking about, it's really important that we think about, what is our culture like in our organization? Where is our organization in terms of our diversity, equity, inclusion journey? Are we implementing specific policies? Is your board or executive director resistant to racial equity or thinks that isn't a problem, right? Being transparent with potential candidates is really important because they have to consider how much emotional and psychological burden they might have coming in. The other thing to think about when you're thinking about recruiting is where are we recruiting, right? So, a lot of times when we are providing consulting on people and culture, folks may ask us, well, where do you think we should recruit? The places that we're currently recruiting are LinkedIn, Idealist, maybe Indeed. Yeah, we spread the word of mouth through social media. And unfortunately, that hasn't helped our nonprofits get more diverse applicants. Well, if we're working primarily in a white-led organization or organizations that are not as diverse, we have to recognize like, what does our personal networks look like, right? And so if you were to ask Fiona, myself or Cassie, what our personal networks are like outside of work, we'll tell you that they're primarily made up of Black, Indigenous people of color. And that might be different than what our white colleagues say at work, right? The other thing to think about is moving beyond diversity to inclusion in recruitment and hiring. So where are the applicants that we're trying to attract looking for jobs? Specifically, are they looking on Craigslist? Are they members of people of color, nonprofit professionals groups on social media? If you're hiring a recruiter to help you fill a position, have we asked if that recruiter actually specializes in diversity recruitment? And what does that actually mean for them? Are they from the community that they're trying to hire from? And if not, then how do they work with organizations to ensure that whoever they're placing isn't going to become a token hire, right? That's something that is really important to be thinking about. In terms of salaries and pay, I think one of the things that we, it's a law now in California that, when we are putting out job descriptions, that we actually have to be specific with the range of the salary. And so, we always advocate for stopping, if we're going to write like salaries commensurate with experience, well, why do we continue to do that, right? By actually putting an actual salary or putting a range, we're promoting transparency. We are supporting the closing of not just racial equity pay gaps, but also gender equity pay gaps. We'll also get more qualified applicants. think one of the things that I've noticed, in over 15 years of hiring is that people who are in middle management and senior management positions, when they're applying for a job, if they see that a salary is not listed, there's one of two assumptions that are being made. So one is that the organization does not understand or value diversity, equity, and inclusion. The second one is the organization is probably, the salary is probably so low that I'm not even gonna spend my time applying, right? And so automatically we are losing out on unqualified applicants. When it comes to treating everyone as an individual, it's really thinking about, Cassie, you can move forward a couple of slides, to the treating everyone as individual. So really, it's about equity, it's not about equality. And so instead of having the same benefits or salary structures across the organization, how can we treat everyone equitably, right? So standardized benefits or compensation packages for all employees addresses equality, but not equity, right? So for example, a lot of our organizations have a standard, we give 8 paid sick days off per year, right? But staff who have disability issues, whether it's physical or mental, or staff who are experiencing racialized trauma might actually need more sick days than staff who don't, right? If your organization provides a parking benefit, for example, you subsidize the cost of parking in like downtown San Francisco. Well, what happens for staff who don't own cars or for whom carpool? Right? Are they getting a fully subsidized parking pass? What about staff who are traveling further away because it's cheaper to live further away from wherever the workplace is, right? Are we subsidizing them for that additional mileage? One thing that I often hear is that, well, we have some sort of retirement plan and we match up to a certain percentage, right? The question is really, do we penalize staff who cannot afford to put that much into retirement? So I can give you a personal example of in my first nonprofit job working with refugees and immigrants, the organization matched up to 3% for retirement of whatever I put in. I was making so little and living paycheck to paycheck that I could barely put 1% in. And so people who were in senior leadership positions who could afford that 3% were putting 3% in, but I wasn't getting enough, right? And so technically I was losing out on 2% per year, but that losing out of that 2% wasn't given to me as an additional benefit anywhere else. Really thinking also about, the other thing with salaries and treating everyone as an equal is thinking about, who are we putting in terms of people first? And so that's the next one. And so first we have to really do a deep dive, right, into our paid leave. And so the vacation, the holidays, jury duty, bereavement, racial healing days. By putting people first, we're really prioritizing our employees. So that might mean that there are certain holidays that our employee handbook says that everyone in the organization abides by or has paid leave off, right? And that might include like New Year's Day, right? It might include the 4th of July. It might include Memorial Day, right? What about employees who celebrate specific holidays? And so, for example, the state of California made Lunar New Year a new state holiday this year. Organizations are trying to decide, are we going to follow that and give people a day off? California also has Cesar Chavez Day off, right? There's also no law that says that our holidays have, as stated in our employee handbooks, have to be written the way that the federal holidays are. And so I worked with an Indigenous community in Iowa a couple of years ago, and they refuse to write July 4th or Independence Day in their employee handbook because for them, it was not an Independence Day for their community. And so I think they actually wrote it as like Colonizers Day. They still got it off because the discussion among staff, and this was more to like having a shared discussion with everyone, is that well, our families and our friends and our kids have that day off and we want to spend that time with them, or we need to do childcare. And so we want the 4th day of July off, but we're going to call it Colonizers Day, right? Instead of the 4th of July. They did the same thing for Thanksgiving. They called it Truthsgiving in their employee handbook. When it comes to bereavement, I think that's something that's really important to think about in terms of when we provide bereavement, are we taking into account the culture that our staff person is in? And so in an organization that Fiona and I worked at, which was primarily Asian and Pacific Islander, we provided bereavement leave beyond the immediate family. We also extended it to be aunties and uncles who may not be related to us, but are considered family. In some Indigenous communities, whenever there's a funeral, it's expected that everyone goes for a certain number of days, and that it can be dishonorable if you do not go, even if you barely knew the person. And so I think that it's really important for us to be thinking about what does that actually mean. When it comes to, student loans, right? There have been some organizations that have provided some benefits to helping support the payment of student loans. Now, up until I think last year, there was a federal program that essentially said if you worked 10 plus years in the nonprofit sector, then you can get a portion of your loans reduced. Well, the reality was that getting through that system and proving that you were at a nonprofit for 10 years was so difficult that I think only 2% of people actually had their loans forgiven, right? And so does your organization support people with filing that paperwork? So something to be thinking about. And then typical work schedules. And so what does your typical work schedule look like? Do you have predefined, predetermined business hours? Is it expected that people are in the office 9 to 5, right? Well, what happens if you have kids who, go to school a little bit later, or their daycare starts a little bit later? What happens if you have staff who are juggling their work hours with their spouse, right? And what about, if you have staff who are not productive at 9 in the morning, as some of my colleagues may know, and might be more productive later in the day. And so are we taking those things into account as well? And then next, we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility, because I think it's something for us to really be thinking about. Whenever we talk about accessibility, I think one of the first things that comes to our mind is a wheelchair. And so the question is, do we only consider ADA when we're required to? And when we're required, and I think we need to move beyond. I think it's important that we try to be accessible for people who are in wheelchairs and beyond just installing ramps and elevators. But what about other types of disabilities? What about intellectual disability? What about people who require service dogs? And really thinking also about, the reality is that with people who might need a service dog who is trained can cost upwards of $30,000. And it's not something that's covered by health insurance. And so a lot of people actually have to train their own dogs. And so the question is, how do we provide for that, given that what we know in the last 2 years of the pandemic and the subsequent trauma and mental health issues since then, is that more and more people have needed additional support animals for a variety of different reasons, even if it's just to get through the day. And then the other thing around accessibility is language, right? And so do we have staff who are not proficient in English? And if we are, then are our workplaces set up so that they are able to operate in whatever native language it is for them? The other thing is that even for staff who have, they're great at conversational English, or even you would say maybe like pretty advanced in conversation, the question is, are they able to handle complex conversations or meetings that are being provided in English so that they can adequately participate? And so when Fiona, Cassie, and I do diversity, equity, inclusion work with organizations, there are times when people who are great at English may not understand what inclusion actually means, right? Or anti-oppression, or even the word oppression, because it's not a word that they've grown up with. It's not a word that is in their native language. It means something different. And so let me put Fiona on the spot for a moment. So Fiona, how do we address issues where we have staff who seem like they're proficient in English, but struggle with some of those more complex terms? What are some of the things that we advise?
Oh, we definitely advise making sure that we have access to interpreters. If it's a, let's say, a conversation about a substantive document, a 10-page document, a 5-page document, sharing that document with interpreters to translate that document so that the person can then review it in their preferred language and then come to the table empowered and knowledgeable enough with the content to have those conversations. We also suggest time is always a crucial element of cultivating equity and belonging. Slow it down, right? That, urgent decision that has to have been made yesterday, put some strategic thought and forethought into it so that a component of a slower processing time is built into whatever it is that you're doing. So folks have time to read, interpret, analyze in whichever preferred language that they have. Jess?
Yeah, and that really comes back to like understanding our biases around that. So a recent example, personal example, is so I'm on the board of a national nonprofit organization and I'm the treasurer. And I was speaking with their bookkeeper actually last week. And over the last 2 months, I've been asking for financial policies, accounting policies, just to ensure that they have internal controls in place. This is just a checks and balances to make sure that, there's no fraud, right? Or anything like that. So I say that, Cassie's nodding her head. She's like, I understand what you're saying. All right. So this is a bookkeeper who's been in the US, studied accounting, been in the US for the last 30 years, and have been working for our organization for 25. So I give her a month to give me those policies. At the end of it, she gives me her accounting manual that she's written for herself to do her own job. That's not what I was asking for. And so when we had this conversation, it was really around when she heard the word policy, she heard manual. When I said internal controls, she thought it meant something else. And even though these are things that are discussed within her field, there was a conversation that had to be had about like, should I have asked her this in Mandarin? Right. So even for someone who has advanced proficiency and can understand English, still has issues with that. Right. And I say that as someone who is, someone who learned English in elementary school. And so really not assuming that simply because someone has lived in this country or seem like they're fluent, that they completely understand that line of communication. And so I'm going to pass it back over to Fiona to talk a little bit about power sharing and supervision.
So I love that I just saw in the chat that someone was already getting to this. So to whomever you are, you had a preview of our presentation. But yeah, we really believe that in shifting and uplifting equity and belonging in our nonprofit organizations, we really have to shift to power sharing versus supervision. And even for those organizations that are service provision and like they have social workers on staff, and we often have these meetings that the name of the meetings I find offensive. It's supervision. Really? I thought we were checking in with each other to support one another, to review the number of cases, to troubleshoot cases. I thought we were sharing information, sharing resources, lifting up and empowering each other. But this meeting is called supervision? Really? And then going back to the history of where the word supervision and supervisor came from. Some things that we can do in annual evaluations, be specific about what it is that we want people to work towards, and not having that be a punitive process, but here, what is it that you would like to do, right? What's your 2-year, 3-year, 5-year, 10-year plan? And how can this organization support you in getting there? Right. In years past, there was a advocate that I was working with, and she was providing daily direct support for survivors. But she really wanted to know what's happening in this administrative level. Like, what are all those meetings you're going to, Fiona? And I see you're writing all these grant proposals. I want to learn more about that. All right, so let's power share. Let's build that into your annual evaluation about, how many proposals are you submitting content to, or you're going to shadow me. How many times have you shadowed me? You're going to work on empowering yourself so that when the opportunity becomes available, possibly you can shift into that space. So annual evaluations don't have to be punitive. It doesn't have to be, you didn't tick this box, you didn't check that box, but more about how can we support you in growing and building that in. And basically, and I'm seeing in the chat some more affirmation around that, whoops. We should focus on, let's see what happened in the chat. Focus on understanding and defining phrases and moving away from supervision and all of that. Also, one last thing, Jess, what we've often found, particularly with folks who have marginalized identities, that staff are sort of left to their own devices until they mess up, right? And that those supportive and uplifting spaces that are supposed to be continuous and regular are the first thing to go when there's, a fire on the front burner, right? And when we slip in providing those spaces and folks are out there doing their job without the adequate support, when things go off the rails, we are really, we readily sacrifice people, right? That they messed up, that they got it wrong, as opposed to, for me, the flip side of power sharing is also about accountability owning. So if I left a staff person to flounder without having regular check-ins, without providing support, without empowering, without providing information, without sharing power, and then things go off the rails, I shouldn't hang that person out to dry, right? I should move into a space of, here is my role in what just transpired, and being transparent about that. So that's just my little spiel about that. So next one. So in terms of, Healing Equity United and all of us in general, how can we help? We want to shift from HR to people and culture. We want to, some folks say, decolonize human resources. And Jess and I have been debating, I want to say uncolonize human resources, right? So what would our interactions in these workspaces look like if we never were introduced to some of the principles of colonization and enslavement? So, review our policies and practices through an equity lens, right? Maybe the decision, and Jess referred to this earlier, maybe the decision is we all get 20 days PTO, but that individuals can choose for themselves which holidays that's going to be, or how they're going to manage that and shift that around. We want to assess where your organization currently is in terms of its policies and practices. And so as consultants, we can help you to try to really focus on people and the workplace culture, we want to not only review human resources, policies, and practices, but we want to change the culture at large. I know that at Healing Equity United, we often have conversations about, DEI is often placed in HR and is placed on the shoulder, the responsibility of advancing equity is placed on the shoulders of one individual in HR, right? Well, given the history of HR that we just discussed, right, is that fair? Or is that a setup for disaster or for failure, right? So in terms of advancing equity and promoting a culture of belonging, it's everyone's responsibility. And at least from my perspective, it should not live exclusively in the realm of HR. But we can also, as a Healing Equity United, we can have listening sessions with your staff to, get an unvarnished opinion about what's going well, all right, and what are some gaps and challenges, and then really sort of shift what's happening inside the nonprofit organization. And the recruitment and retention, we see this as a merry-go-round again and again. People say, we want to have a diverse staff. They hire one person with, who is a member of the global majority, or who is, Black, Indigenous, or person of color, and then that person leaves. And we say, well, we just put so much effort in recruiting and hiring, and then the person just left. Well, we have to ask ourselves why. So the focus should also be about retention and changing the culture, changing our practices to make the space and the organization more welcoming of the people who we are bringing in to diversify, right? Sometimes it's, we'll hire you as long as you aren't a squeaky wheel, right? Be quiet. Don't ask us to change anything. Don't ask us to, accept a new way of doing things. Just be a good poster child for the fact that we are finally advancing equity. So Jess or Cassie, would either of you like to add anything else to what it is that Healing Equity United can help them do for shifting from HR to people and culture focus?
No, let's jump to the questions, because I know we have some questions. So Cassie, if you want to ask us the questions that have come in.
Yeah, and please continue to put your questions into the Q&A section, and we'll try to get through as many as we possibly can. I just wanted to catch, there was one in the chat that I think would be good to uplift. Someone asked, I would find it helpful for the panel to offer thoughts on how technology can help shift from HR to people and culture. And so Jess or Fiona, if you want to take that one on.
Actually, Cassie, do you want to start with that one? I know tech is really more mine and your expertise around this.
I was curious what was coming up for you, Jess. I'll follow up.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things, right? So I think that one of the things that we saw during the pandemic is that there were individuals who were kind of struggling and still are struggling with tech, right? And so really the question is like, how are we supporting our colleagues who are struggling to figure out how to use Zoom? I mean, Fiona and I did a training recently for a group of facilitators who, we role played, like what happens on Zoom, and some of them weren't really sure of like, how do you navigate, if someone becomes an avatar in the middle of it, right? Or if you have people who are causing issues, right? So one is really, are we providing that additional training? The other question that I would have is like, are we expecting that that our staff are using their own equipment, particularly laptops and computers at home, right? And if so, are we providing any additional support for them to be able to get updated equipment? Some of us have computers at home that are 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, right? And for some of us, that's as old as our computers are at work, and right. And so that kind of reduces our productivity. I think that's something to think about, but then also like we have issues of people having difficulty with access to the internet. And so if that happens, right, are we helping to support paying for some of their internet, right? Or, if they are in a remote location, a rural location where it's harder for them, to get connected, right? Are there spaces that we can pay for, like a co-working space, or can they come into the office on certain days in order to use the internet? So those were a couple of things that I was thinking about, in addition to providing closed captioning and other tech accessibility features. What were you thinking about, Cassie?
Yeah, I think the educator in me, in addition to what you already shared, just the educator in me was thinking about different learning styles, right? And so I think technology is a great way to incorporate different ways that people can take in information, right? And then I also think about how we move away from that white supremacist norm of worship of the written word. What are the ways in which we can capture information through other forms other than writing, right? Can we, in terms of an onboarding process, as we're downloading information, can we do that in a video format so that folks who are more of visual learners can take that information in through more of an interactive video? And so that's one thing that came up for me. Thanks for that question. That was in the chat. I see it. We have a couple more coming in. I think this one would be a good one to uplift. Someone asked, do you have any recommendations in how to make the interview process more equitable? So Jess or Fiona, you want to take
I'm
that
gonna
one?
let Fiona start because she just burst out laughing. So Fiona, what are you thinking?
Oh my goodness, I love that question. Thank you so much. So there are a couple of things. Oh, there's so many. So those interview processes where folks are required to give work product before they're even hired or even have the prospect of a job. So, write this report, or, do this and do that, and then present it. How are you reimbursing me for my time? Because it's valuable, right? So like there, I'm already, there are some job descriptions that really make potential applicants feel like I have to be a nuclear physicist in order to interview for this job, right? So reviewing the job descriptions, inserting lived experiences, and prioritizing lived experiences. The panel interview, right? Do we really need 5 people to have a conversation with this one person, right? Another thing that we actually heard this several times in some of our workshops, where there was a person who identified as a member of the global majority who was being interviewed. There were 2 interviewers, both of whom agreed that the person was qualified. One of whom said, well, I think that that person might cause problems by just being a little too vocal about social justice issues. And the other person was like, I froze. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know how to counter it. So we can build in sort of practices and procedures about how to hold each other accountable and to note biases when they show up in the interviewing process. There's so many more. We can have a webinar just on that, Jess and Cassie. But I'll be quiet now and let Jess or Cassie continue.
Yeah, I think just a couple things that I would add on to this. I know that there's debates around sending interview questions ahead of time, but I am really an advocate for that. When I think about an interview process and we're asking these difficult questions, why are we trying to put people on the spot, right? And so providing that time, even if it is just an hour before, and letting them know you will get the interview questions an hour before, so save this time so that you can prep for the interview, that can make the world of a difference in terms of folks who maybe need a little bit more time in processing. And then one thing that I'll also add, for folks that get to a final interview and don't get the position, what are you offering for them for the time that as Fiona mentioned, for the time that they're putting in, not only are we thinking about like compensation, but what kind of feedback are you giving them in terms of maybe what they could improve or what would have taken them to the next step to potentially get that opportunity so that they can take that into the rest of the job hunt. Because we know that that can be a second job in and of itself, looking for a new position. Jess?
Yeah, I would add, the only thing that I would add is to consider like couple of things, right? People are really nervous in interviews, and people who have never really interviewed before or been told that you should just be lucky with whatever you get in a job may not have stellar interview skills. And so really for us, in order to see if an applicant fits and in order to make the process more equitable, I think what I've tried to do in the past is to say that we're having a conversation. This is not necessarily an interview, right? This is a conversation. To try to help them be more comfortable. I think the other thing is that, speaking of who's on the interview panel, I mean, think about like who is on your interview panel. Is it just people who are managers and directors, right? Or do we have other folks in the organization who are frontline staff people who do similar work, right? Who would be working with them a lot? Do they have equal say? And who's going to be hired? Would they have more say than even the director if it's someone that they're going to be supervising? And so just think about it from that equity perspective. And so I think we only have a couple of minutes left, Cassie. And so I know that there's a couple of things we want to share before we close. And so if anyone had any questions that we didn't get to, Cassie's going to put our emails up so you can feel free to contact us there. But I'll pass it to you now, Cassie.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. And thank you so much for those additional questions. Again, if you would like to follow up with us, our email, our contact information is up here. And we also wanted to plug some of our upcoming trainings as well. For those of you who are looking to incorporate more of an anti-oppressive, anti-racist culture on your boards, maybe you yourself are a board member and wanting to learn how to incorporate this into your time volunteering with your nonprofits, we highly encourage you to check out this training. And then we also have our February free webinar that is coming up. And this one will be on the difference between unpacking anti-Blackness and doing anti-racism work. And so we really encourage you to attend that one in February as well. And Jess and Fiona, is there anything that I might be missing?
I think the only other thing to really share is that we're going to be sharing a link to this recording with you all so you can have the information. And yeah, we look forward to maybe seeing you all at one of our upcoming webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.